Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Duels. So, this week we're going to be taking a look at a subscriber deck, and it's going to be a strange one because I can't for the life of me find the person who sent me this email. So, if you are the owner of this deck, then please come forward so I can give you a proper thank you for sending it in. It's one that we have played on a stream in the past, so there's probably some mention of a name on there, but I can't quite remember where the person is who sent me this deck is. So thank you anyway for sending me it. It is a Drake discard deck, so it focuses a lot around profiting off of discard, and the Drake comes in from the namesake card for our Drake Haven. So for 2 and a blue, enchantment, whenever you cycle or discard a card you may pay 1. If you do, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. So at its core, it's a Drake deck, essentially, built around this enchantment, but it's actually a really interesting deck all the same, because it doesn't even need Drake Haven to go off and do its fun little combos, because we've got lots of discard outlets, things like our Call the Bloodline. Call the Bloodline is 1 and a black enchantment. For 1 mana, you get to discard a card, put a 1/1 black Vampire Knight creature token with lifelink onto the battlefield. You can only activate this once each turn. So we get to discard things, and then we can use that to either return things from the graveyard, or even just use it so that we can enable our cyclers, like our discard rewards, like Ruthless Sniper and like Drake Haven. So let's go to the beginning of the deck, shall we? We've got Crypt Breaker. For 1 black mana, we've got a 1/1 zombie. He's got 1 and a black to tap and discard a card, and you put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. So we get to go quite wide with Crypt Breaker by discarding cards that we want to be discarding anyway. So we're not really losing value from this, and we're only gaining value from our 2/2 black zombies. There's a lot of the time we actually want something in the graveyard, or at least the thing we're putting in the graveyard we can get back, and I'll show you a few of those soon enough. He also has a secondary ability as well to tap 3 untapped zombies you control and draw a card, and you lose 1 life. So if we've got 3 tokens on the board, or maybe we've got more Crypt Breakers, we can start drawing cards off of it. I'm not sure how often that will happen though, because I don't believe we've got much of a zombie synergy in here. We've got Prized Amalgams, which if both of them are in the graveyard, we can pull them back and have 3 with the Crypt Breaker, I suppose. And we do also have Haunted Dead as well, which can return from the graveyard. In fact, we actually do have a fair bit of the zombie synergy here. So, yeah, we might see a fair bit of the secondary ability there, but who knows. We then got Ruthless Sniper. So for 1 black mana, it's a 1/2. Whenever you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1. If you do, you get to put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. So we do a lot of discarding, which means we can actually make a fair bit of -1/-1 counters, and this is great versus the god cards, who are indestructible, because if their toughness becomes base toughness of 0, then they just die anyway. So Ruthless Sniper is actually a way of removing god cards, which are seeing quite a lot of play in the meta right now. But for the most part, he's just here to pick off maybe the flying tokens, plant tokens, that kind of thing. Maybe even just reduce the size of something to the point where it's not really useful anymore and can delay the game out. We then have Sanitarium Skeleton. For 1 black mana. This is a 1/2 creature, and this is a great discard outlet. We only really want 1 in the deck anyway, because as soon as we've got 1 going in and out of the graveyard, we don't want to be drawing into any others, essentially. And we do have a lot of other things that are worth discarding, so it's not the end of the world if we don't see this guy anyway. So he's got an ability that says 2 and a black, return Sanitarium Skeleton from your graveyard to your hand. So we can discard with certain things, maybe paying to discard Crypt Breaker, and get a 2/2 black zombie, and then at a later time when we need something to discard maybe, or any kind of that kind of synergy, then we can just pay the 3, pull it back to our hand, maybe discard it again. We then have Renegade Maps, just a nice little way of thinning out our deck here. It also triggers Revolt for the Fatal Pushes as well. So Renegade Map is a 1 colourless artifact that ends the battlefield tapped, and then you get to tap it when it untaps, of course. Sacrifice it and search your library for a basic land, reveal it and put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. It's basically a tap land, a tapped mono-coloured land that allows us to thin out our deck find the colours that we need, because we do have a lot of double blacks, and I think we do have some double blues in here. Yeah, we've got the advanced stick swings later on in the game, but still double blues nonetheless that we need to make sure we've got our mana for. We then got 2 copies of Fatal Push, so for 1 black mana, instant speed, destroy target creature if it's got converted mana cost 2 or less. So it's really good removal in the early game, and then in the late game, if we can trigger the Revolt, then it actually gets to deal with a lot of creatures in the late game as well, which can be quite the pain. The biggest example for a converted mana cost 4 or less creature is maybe Kalatas, who when a creature dies, he gets to exile it instead, and make a 2/2 black zombie, because we kind of do want to cycle between our graveyard and the battlefield. So having our creatures die isn't the end of the world, but having them being exiled is a very big pain in the arse. So having removal for him there with the Fatal Push is pretty good. And as we mentioned, we've got the Renegade maps to trigger the Revolt on that one, plus a lot of things that die and return. So we can see Fatal Push being useful for its secondary ability here quite often. We then have Wharf Infiltrator, so for 1 and a blue, we got a 1/1 with Skulk. Whenever Wharf Infiltrator deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So he gets to loot whenever it becomes unblocked and deals combat damage, essentially. And what Skulk means is that it cannot be blocked by creatures that are bigger than it. So if it would be killed by something, it's likely that it's not able to be blocked unless it's going to be traded. Only 1 power creatures can block Wharf Infiltrate, which does mean that they will kill it, but those are few and far between, and we can probably just get back the Wharf Infiltrator somehow later down the line. So whenever you discard a creature card, when this guy's on the battlefield as well, it doesn't necessarily have to be from his ability, then you get to pay 2, and if you do, you get to create a 3/2 colourless Eldrazi Horror creature token and put it onto the battlefield. So I've actually had this ability go off quite a lot and win me the game without even having to attack him with the Wharf Infiltrator. Being able to loot as well is is pretty much a worse version of a Smuggler's Copter, but with a secondary ability. But if we're using the Wharf Infiltrator to actually use the Smuggler's Copter to loot, we're effectively getting in that damage anyway, and we can pay the 2 on the Wharf Infiltrator's ability just to make that 3/2 if we should choose to do so. And don't forget as well, we've got the Sanitarium Skeleton, which can come back from the graveyard to our hand whenever we want, so we can discard this guy over and over and over again if we want to, for that value. We then got Scrapheap Scrounger. So for 2 colourless mana, we've got a 3/2 that cannot block, and when it goes into the graveyard, you can pay 1 and a black to exile another creature card from your graveyard, and then return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. So if we've got creatures that are just not going to return anymore, things like our Wharf Infiltrator, probably not coming back anytime soon, we can exile them and bring back our Scrounger. Bringing back the Scrounger also triggers things like Prized Amalgam as well. Prized Amalgam, whenever a creature enters the battlefield from the graveyard, then these come back on your end step, as many as there are in your graveyard, so there's a nice little synergy there. Also, when the artifact enters the battlefield under our control, we may return him from our graveyard to our hand. So yet again, like the Sanitarium Skeleton, this is another creature that we can discard because we can get it back later for easy value, that kind of thing. So Scrapheap Scrounger, lot of play here. It's a nice aggressive creature as well in the early game, which is pretty cool, and we don't mind it dying because we can return it. We've then got Smuggler's Copter. We've talked about this a little bit. So it's a 2-mana 3/3 flying vehicle, and when it attacks or blocks, you get to loot, and you can crew it for 1 to attack over the top. So every single creature in our deck is able to crew the Smuggler's Copter, which is pretty good. We then got Key to the City, another discard outlet, but also allows us to get in for unblockable damage as well. So for 2 mana, we've got an artifact that taps to discard a card and make one of our creatures unblockable this turn. When it becomes untapped, you may pay 2, and if you do, we get to draw a card. So we can use it to draw extra cards, we can use it to go unblockable and loot, and we can use it to discard things we might want in our graveyard anyway. So maybe we want a Scrounger back and we don't want the Wharf Infiltrator, we can discard the Infiltrator, use it to get back the Scrounger, that kind of thing. Call the Bloodline, we've talked about. It is a discard outlet that puts 1/1 lifelinking creatures onto the field, which is pretty cool. 1 copy of Grasp of Darkness as some of our removal, so for double black, which is probably why it's only a single copy for difficulty of casting purposes, and I'm sure we've got better removal as well in the deck. Instant speed, target creature gets -4/-4 until the end of the turn. So the -4 actually takes away the toughness, so it can get around indestructibility. Hazaret, I believe, is a 5/4, so it would instantly kill Hazaret in this case. So that's pretty good. But ultimately, it's just here to kill a lot of creatures in the format right now. We then got Macabre Waltz. So this is our way of getting back any creature we want whatsoever from our graveyard. For 1 and a black sorcery speed, return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Then we discard a card. So yet again, we're discarding here, but we're not really losing value out the discard because we can use some sort of discard benefiting card like Drakehaven in order to get the value there. And we get 2 creature cards from it in return. Prize Amalgam we've talked about, and Drakehaven we're talking about. Overchase Daredevils, 4/2. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you get to return it from your graveyard to your hand. So we can use this as an aggressive attacker as well to force trades, because whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, we get to pull all of them back from our graveyard if we want to. So that is the Scrapheap Scroungers, but it's also the Smuggler's Copters, the Key to the Cities, and even the Girapa Orreries, which we'll get to in a second. These guys are sweet in this deck. We've then got the Haunted Dead, another way to trigger the prize amalgams in our graveyard, but also another way to discard cards as well. We can get a lot of stuff from this card. So for a 3 and a black, we've got a 2/2, which is a little bit terrible. And as the battlefield, you get to put a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying onto the battlefield. So it's essentially 3 power and toughness, with 1 of that power and toughness being flying. Not the best value in the world, but it is repeatable value, which is where the mana cost comes in. And once this guy's in the graveyard, you're actually just paying 2 in order to get that, so you're getting more value from Haunted Dead being in your graveyard. The only thing is that we have to discard 2 cards, so sometimes we need to discard cards that we don't want to in order to return them to from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped, but the White Spirit comes into play untapped, so we get to actually have this as a blocker at instant speed as well, which is pretty cool. But the main reason we want to be discarding lots of cards like the Haunted Dead is for the Girapa Orrery. So for 4 colourless mana, we've got an artifact that says each player may play an additional land on each of his or her turns. Should mention that this is a synchronous card, which means that our opponent gets the same benefits as we do from this card. The only difference is that our deck is built to take advantage of those extras. So we might not be able to play additional lands on each turn, but the thing that we can do is get ourselves empty-handed very easily. So we use things like Haunted Dead in order to discard all of the cards in our hand. And then at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if they've got no cards in hand, they draw 3 cards. That's not in addition to the card that you draw for the turn. So we go up to 4 cards from, let's say, 2 from our discarding of the Haunted Dead there. Discard 2 cards, we draw 4 on our next turn. And then we can play additional lands from that hand, but we can also discard them to all of our discard outlets to get Drakehaven tokens, that kind of thing. And we can repeat this over and over again. I've managed to do the second ability maybe 3 times in a row at some points as well, where our opponent gets no value off of that secondary ability. We then have Languish, so there's 1 copy of this for a board wipe. Might consider drawing an extra one in here, mostly because of all the creatures in our deck that can just come straight back. It's not really much of a worry when we wipe our own board, so maybe an extra board wipe might be quite useful, but we'll see. Not for me to change it at this point in time. So for 2 and 2 black, sorcery speed, all creatures get -4/-4. We then have Tezzeret the Schemer. Tezzeret's a cool card. I like Tezzeret. 2 and a blue and a black for a 5 loyalty planeswalker, and you get to tick up for 1 and create a colourless artifact token named Ethereum Cell, and that has the ability to sacrifice the artifact and add 1 mana of any colour to your mana pool. Remember that it is an artifact as well that says whenever an artifact enters the battlefield in your control, you get to return this. So Tezzeret's +1 also returns the Ovalchase Daredevils back from the graveyard to your hand as well, so that's a pretty decent +1 in the right situation. And a -2, also a really good removal here. Target creature gets +X, -X until the end of the turn, where X is the number of artifacts you control. So we're plussing all the time with Tezzeret. So we're generating artifacts every single turn, plus we're also playing our own artifacts. The -2 could be a removal spell, but it could also be a pump spell for us, depending on the situation. And then the -7, the ultimate for Tezzeret, You get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 5/5. So these Ethereum cells can become 5/5s every single turn. Our orrery could be turned into a 5/5 if we wanted to. We only really want to be doing that on things that we want to get back, though. We can also turn Key to the City into a 5/5, and this actually means that we don't have to use the discard side of Key to the City in order to take advantage of the secondary ability, because when we attack in with a Key to the City 5/5, when it becomes untapped at the beginning of our turn, we can actually pay the 2 to draw a card there as well. So there is a lot of value in that kind of strategy there. We then got Advanced Stitchwing, so for 3 and 2 blue for a 3/4 flying zombie horror. You can consider these guys sort of the same thing as Haunted Dead in a way. 3/4 flying with pay 2 and a blue to discard 2 cards and then return it from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So it can return itself straight onto the battlefield just by discarding 2 cards, and it really works well with the orrery. We then got the Archfiend of Ifnir, so for 3 and 2 black for a 5/4 flying. It's pretty good for a 5/4 flying for 5 on its own. However, whenever you cycle or discard another card, you get to put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control. So in the right situation, if we are using things like our Advanced Stitchwing to discard 2 cards, we actually get to give everything -2/-2 permanently with an Archfiend. And in the early game as well, it's got cycling, so we can pay 2 to discard this card, yet again making good use of the Drake Haven, because whenever we cycle a card we can pay an extra 1 to make a Drake. And we also get to discard it and get a redraw. So in the early game maybe this isn't so useful, and we want to make sure that we're getting where we need to go. Maybe we want to be digging for our orrery, that kind of thing. Then the Archfiend cycle can allow us to do that. We then got the Sky Sovereign Console Flagship for 5 mana, so a 6/5 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you get to deal 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and when it attacks, you get to do the same thing. It does have crew of 3, which does mean that it's difficult to crew in some situations, but we've got our Stitchwings that are repeatable, crewable creature forms for the Sky Sovereign. We can also tap the Haunted Dead and the Flyer as well. Don't forget you can tap 2 creatures in order to crew. Pay the crew costs, so it is doable for us to get this Sky Sovereign into play, and it's also decent removal as well. And a 6/5 flyer that can get rid of other flyers to swing through that damage is awesome. Finally, we've got Never to Return. So Never is a 1 and double black sorcery speed, destroy target creature or planeswalker, so really good for Super Friends. Really good just straight up removal for any creature that we want to get rid of, as long as it's not hexproof or indestructible. The other side is Return, so for 3 and a black sorcery speed, it has Aftermath, which means you cast it from your graveyard and then exile it. And when we exile a target card from anybody's graveyard, we get to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So that synergizes with our Crypt Breakers, but it also allows us to get rid of maybe graveyard recurring creatures in our opponent's deck. Maybe they're playing Reanimator and we want to get rid of that. Maybe they've got a Commit to Memory in their graveyard and we don't want them to essentially empty our graveyard and redraw our 7 because we've got Girapurori that we might want to make good use of, and being empty-handed actually benefits us in a certain way. So maybe that is a line of play for that kind of thing, but yeah, it depends on the situation of course. But getting rid of creature cards from our opponent's graveyard, their own essential Scrap Heap Scroungers, for example, if they're tapped out, we can exile them for good, that kind of thing. Anyway, that's essentially the deck. Let's go on to the mana base. We've got 6 islands and 8 swamps. We've then got 2 copies of Sunken Hollow, which are an island swamp, blue-black then, a battlefield unless you control 2 or more basic islands. We've got plenty in our deck. And then we've got Drowned Catacombs as well. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control an island or a swamp. We've got our Sunken Hollows that count for both, and also our basics in order to make that come into play on turn 2, untapped. Sanitarium allows us to loot as well. It does allow our opponent to do it, but there are situations where we can effectively make sure that we're getting the only bit of value out of that. If our opponent's got no cards in hand and we've got 1, then our opponent's getting no value unless that card is a Madness card. Normally it just adds colourless mana to our mana pool as well. And then we've got 2 copies of Drownyard Temple, which are colourless lands. which we are going to be using to discard a lot of the time because we can actually pay 3, return Drownyard Temple from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So we can actually use Drownyard Temple in order to ramp and play an additional land on the turn. It is a colourless land, which does not really help to cast our doubles, but by that time I'm sure we've got all the cards we need. Alright guys, that's going to do it for the deck. If you did enjoy the look of the deck, then be sure to check out the matches that should be following shortly after. And hit that like button and subscribe as well if you want to see more Magic Duels and other content. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon as well, and that will give you notifications when all of my videos go live. I do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.